In this video, I'm going to cover how to create custom collisions for your static meshes inside Unreal Engine 5, as well as how to do them in Maya. This way you'll have both sides of the workflow, and you'll be able to use both whenever needed. Primarily, you'll be sticking inside Unreal Engine 5, but there are some occasions where you need to create them along with your mesh from your 3D modeling application from Maya and export them together so the custom collisions can be imported along with your mesh into UE5. I'm going to cover a lot here, and by the end you will know everything you need for creating custom collisions for your static meshes. So let's begin. For this tutorial, I'm going to use an asset pack, Infinity Tiled Rooms and Pools, that I released on fab.com. And I already have all these static meshes imported into Content Browser into UE5. But before we get started with this, we need to take a step back and cover the very basics of what happens when you export a mesh and you import it into UE5. So here in Maya, I have a simple cube, which is 1 meter all the way across, or 100 centimeters. And all I'm going to do is simply export this as the cube with the default settings for FBX and import it into UE5 so you can see what happens and the default options that are enabled. So I'm going to export this as a selection and name it cube. Again, this is just for a test, just so we get to see what happens. And I am exporting this as FBX, and my options are right here. Smoothing groups enabled and smooth mesh is enabled. And let's go ahead and just export. Pretty standard for a static mesh. Then inside UE5, I'm simply going to take that FBX and drag it into the content folder, into the open folder that you see here to import it. And let's reset everything to default. So everything has been reset to default. And the option that I want to show you is this one right here, generate missing collisions. So by default, when you import your static meshes, UE5 will generate any missing collisions for your static mesh. If we had collisions associated with it, meaning that we created custom collisions in Maya along with our static mesh to be exported together, then it would bring in that custom collision along with our mesh. However, we just simply exported the mesh. We did not do custom collisions in Maya. So UE5 recognizes this, and it will generate missing collisions for your mesh. If you do not want to have UE5 generate missing collisions in import, just simply disable this. Now, since this is enabled by default, let's go ahead and keep it on and see what happens. But if you disable it, nothing will be generated and your mesh will not have any collisions associated with it. You'll be able to walk right through it. Now we're going to keep this at default and simply hit import all. And let's find that cube right here. So I'm going to drag it into our level, and if I spawn, since we generated missing collisions, our player will be blocked. We won't be able to walk through it. If we open this static mesh up by simply double clicking on it, this opens up a static mesh editor. And we can take a look at what the collisions are for this mesh by going to show and enabling simple collisions. This will show what the collisions are that UE5 generated, or whatever the collisions are associated with this mesh. And you can see this cube right here, this green collision box. These are this mesh's collisions. Now we are going to be creating simple collisions. We're not going to be dealing with complex collisions. So this is why we're going to be using simple collision checkbox to see what the collisions are for this mesh. We will cover briefly complex collisions, but we're not going to be using this because it's more expensive. And for regular static meshes, for environment props and assets, for modular environments, you want to be using and creating simple collisions. They're cheaper, they're faster, and that's what you should be using for your environment assets. So by enabling simple collisions, you can take a look at what those collisions are, whether they are created inside UE5 or you imported them along with your mesh from Maya. Now let me briefly go to the sphere, so that way we have a different object, and I'm going to export this as our mesh. Again, we don't have any collisions here. We're going to cover custom collisions from Maya to UE5 later in the video. So I'm going to take this sphere and export as a selection. I'm going to name it sphere, so we have something different. And I'm going to export with all the same options as FBX and export selection. Let's go ahead and bring that sphere in. And for this one, I'm going to disable generate missing collisions. You probably already know what's going to happen. It simply won't create any collisions and we'll be able to walk right through it. So let's go ahead and import all. Take a look at our sphere. I'm going to open this up inside the static mesh editor and let's take a look at our collisions. Show, simple collision, and nothing shows up. That means that this sphere, this static mesh, does not have any collisions. If I place it inside the level and spawn, we'll be able to walk right through the sphere. Nothing will stop us. So that's the option you need to be aware of when you import your meshes into UE5 by default. So whether you keep that option on or off is going to depend on you. I do like to keep it on. This way I have some kind of collisions generated by default. And all these meshes that you see right now inside the static mesh editor, all of them have had missing collisions generated by default by UE5. So if I open any of these up right now and take a look at show simple collision, these are the missing collisions that were generated by UE5. This is not very good. This is why we're going to cover how to create these either in UE5 or in Maya. But you can see that these missing collisions right now is not very good because it's actually blocking everything. So the player will not be able to go through this archway. They'll be stopped by it because it's not aligning to the mesh and its curve. For some meshes, so for such as like this column right here, if I take a look at simple collisions, this is pretty good. And again, this is default by UE5. So on import, I don't need to do anything here. I don't need to fix them. I don't need to regenerate them. I don't need to go into Maya and create custom collisions from there, because by default UE5 did a pretty good job for this column. So for many of these, by default, the custom collisions are going to be pretty good. If the object is simple enough, the default collisions will work just fine and you don't need to do anything with it. But for many of these, such as this archway with the door opening, this is not going to be very good. You can see right here, I'm not going to be able to walk through it. So if I place this static mesh and I try to walk through that doorway, I should be able to, but I'll get stopped because UE5 doesn't understand the curvature of the arch and the doorway, and the default collisions that UE5 generated is not very good. So simple meshes, you could probably leave them as is, but for more complex meshes where there is more geometry and more detail, you will have to deal with creating your own custom collisions by either generating them inside UE5, which we're about to cover, as well as going back to Maya and doing them manually to be exported with your mesh, which we'll cover later. Let's go ahead and open up a simple mesh. Let's open up our cube, and let me go ahead and dog this so it's a larger view for us. And let's go to show and take a look at our simple collision. So the collision that UE5 generated is very good. And I would actually keep this and move on to another mesh that I would need to work on. But let's stick with this simple mesh in order to cover how to create your own custom collisions right inside UE5, inside the static mesh editor. So when you see your collision, you can select it by left clicking on it, and you can actually move this collision hole away from the object by modifying it on X, Y, or Z. And if you save this, this mesh will save this collision hole in this specific place. So it will not be on top of an object. Knowing that you can go ahead and drag your collisions and modify it is the first part of modifying and doing something to your collisions. You can then also select your collision hole and hit delete. This will remove any collision. And if I click save, then I essentially removed my collision hole. And this object, this cube, no longer has collisions. And you can actually take a look at number of collision primitives that any given static mesh has. And at the moment, it has 0 because I deleted that collision hole. If I hit Ctrl-Z to undo, you can see that it's now showing 1. A lot of times you will have more than one collision hole for an object, especially more complex objects. So it will be listed right here, the number of collision holes your static mesh has. A better way to remove collisions and remove all of them, especially if you have more than one collision hole and you don't want to have to select each individual object or each individual hole and having to hit delete, you can just simply go to collisions drop-down menu and choose remove collision. It will remove all collision holes. And then underneath the same drop-down menu, this is where you can create simplified collisions. You can add a sphere simplified collision. So you can see that it created one right here. Now, of course, this is not going to work for a cube. We can go and add another one. Let's do a capsule. And anytime you use a drop-down menu and add another simplified collision, this will add another collision hole on top and into your existing collision holes you may already have. So if I choose, let's say, add 26 simplified collision, it now added 3. And you can see right here, the number of collision primitives is now up to 3. I can select each of these and I can move them. I can delete them. I can actually also rotate them and modify them inside this viewport, as well as I can scale them. I can scale them uniformly, or I can scale them non-uniformly on a specific axis. So you have a lot of flexibility by selecting each collision hole, moving it, modifying it by rotating or scaling, as well as adding additional collision holes. So remember, every time you add a new simplified collision hole, it will be added on top of your existing collision holes. So in this case, I don't want to have 3 of these overlapping each other. So I would choose remove all collisions. And now I'm back down to 0. So for this cube, let's go ahead and choose the best one. And in this case, it will be add box simplified collision. And that's it right here. Nice, simple, simplified collision for this box. And in order to save the changes and save the collisions that we just created, click Save to save the mesh. And that's it. I've created a new collision for this cube. Let's go ahead and close this. Let's open up the sphere. And in this case, because we're looking at a sphere, we have a simplified sphere collision that we can use. So let's go to collisions and add sphere simplified collision. And it's perfect. Again, it uses the boundaries of an object and adds in a simplified collision hole mesh based on your size of the object. But if you need to modify it, you know how to do so. Let's go ahead and click Save. And now we have created a collision for the sphere. So if I drag the sphere and spawn inside the level, this sphere now has collisions. Let's go ahead and open up something that requires 2 collision holes. So I'm going to open up this window rounded 150, which it has 2 parts, one on the left, one on the right. And let me dock this. So for this object, we have 1 primitive. So the default collisions are not very good. Let's take a look at them. So we definitely wouldn't want to use this. So the first step is to remove all collisions. And now you can generate your own. So let's do simplified collisions. And I'm going to show you can actually duplicate the simplified collisions inside the viewport. Or actually any collision hole can be duplicated and then resized. So let's do collision, drop down menu and do box simplified collision. You can actually run through all of these. So let me actually delete this one. Let's try something else. Let's try 18. In this case, 18 is not going to do much because we have almost like a simple cube or rectangle. So some of these will work better on more detailed geometry. So in this case, let's go ahead and remove it. And let's create a simple box collision. Now we just have 1 collision hole, but we have 2 objects and I want to have 1 collision hole on each for 2 total collision holes. So I can select this collision hole. Let's switch over to scale and I can scale this to a smaller object. And by scaling down, we have a specific ratio there we are scaling this on. So I can enable or disable or change the scale snapping, which is this icon right here. So I can disable the snapping or I can change in the amount of scale that it snaps along when we are resizing this. So let's go down lower to maybe 0.1. So this will be a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to make this smaller and now I can move it. By using the spacebar, I can cycle between move, rotate, and scale just like we do in the viewport for our objects. And let's go ahead and actually just remove our scale, the snapping for the scale. And I can go ahead and just make this smaller, align it more precisely with the box, with the object, scale it. And now I can actually duplicate this collision hole by holding down Alt and left click and drag. This will duplicate it. And I can just move it over to this part right here, to this area of the static mesh. You can see that we have now 2 collision holes. So we essentially took a collision hole, resized it, and then we duplicated it. And you can duplicate any of these collision holes for the object and move them around, scale them, reposition them, thus creating your collision holes manually. Once you are done, make sure you click Save. And now it's been saved with the object and you would be done for the static mesh. Now let's choose another static mesh. Let's try this lower part of a window. This half window. I'm going to open this up. Let's dock it. And again, let's take a look at our collisions. They're not going to be very good. Now let's remove them. And let's try using one of the higher simplified collisions. So let's try add 26 simplified collision. In this case, again, it's not going to work. It just cannot form itself around this object. So these options right here just simply give you 1 collision hole and they try to modify themselves around that object. So in this case, this is more of a square shape. Let me try another object, something that we can use, the 26 or the 18 version of it. Let's do this rectangular light. Let's take a look at what it generated for us. Simple collision. That's not bad, but it's also not very good. Let's remove it. And let's try one of these higher simplified collisions. Let's try 26. It looks like it used exactly the same one that we just ran. Let me delete it and let's try 18. So again, it's not enough. There's not enough geometry. We would need multiple collision holes for this possibly. Or just a better version of a simplified single collision hole. And it's just, it cannot create one using any of these simplified collisions. So when you run out of options here and you don't want to duplicate and reposition and having to move any of these collision holes around like we did, you have another great option to use, which is called Auto Convex Collision. Go ahead and click on this, and by default you should have this Convex Decomposition already open. So this is what that is. Under Collision, Auto Convex Collision is Convex Decomposition. And with this menu, you can set a more precise way of generating your custom collisions in UE5 by defining the amount of collision holes you want, maximum hole vertices, and then the hole precision that will take into consideration to generate. And with these three options, you can generate very accurate custom collisions in UE5. And this will, most importantly, it will give you the amount of collision holes you would want. So for this, let's go ahead and try one. And let's just run this, but with one collision hole, and hit apply. Once you hit apply, it looks at your object and tries to calculate a collision. Actually, this one is pretty good. You can see that it uses 16 hole verts for a single hole, and it pretty much created a collision hole that's very good. Much better than any of these drop-down simplified collisions try to do. So for this, I would go ahead and actually call it done. I would save it and move on to another object. Let's go ahead and come back to this one. So we no longer have any collisions here. We deleted them. Let's try to run Convex Decomposition. So the amount of hole counts for this, let's run the defaults. Whatever we have here, let's go ahead and run it. Hit apply and take a look. Actually, this is pretty good. It generated 4 collision holes. Here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. It used the max hole vert count at 16, and the precision of this is pretty good. If I wanted to regenerate this and see what it would look like, maybe with, let's do 2, and 16 is fine. We can always bump it up or lower it, depending on how many verts you would want for that specific one collision hole. It'll just be more detailed. You'll have more triangles in that collision hole when you bump this up, but it could often be a little bit more accurate. And let's actually bump up the hole precision from 100,000, let's do 300,000. And let's hit apply. When you hit apply, it removes the previous collisions and regenerates new one. So you don't need to remove it. If you reapply this over and over again, it removes the previous one. So let's hit apply. So in this case, hole count of 2 is not very good. We just don't have enough collision holes for this type of object. Let's go ahead and go up to 3, and maybe let's do 8. Let's lower the verts and keep the same hole precision. Hit apply. There's no real wrong number. It's all a matter of how many holes you want, how detailed do you want those holes to be, and hole precision simply takes longer to calculate. So in this case, this is not very good. So 4 would be the ideal hole count for this mesh. And we could probably keep the hole verts at 8. And it's okay. Let's bump it up to 16. Let's turn this up to 500,000 and hit apply. Kind of gives us the same result. So for this, if you want it to be very precise, let's go down. Let's go up to 6 for hole count of primitives, and let's hit apply. And actually, this is pretty good. It retains its boundaries. It aligns itself right along the curve. So 6 holes for this. I would keep it. I could try 8 hole vert count. See what that would look like. And taking a look, actually this is pretty good as well. So I'd probably go with 8. The lower you can have for your max hole verts and the lower you can have for your hole collision count is the best, while retaining its precision. So that's what you want. You want to be precise, but then you also want to have less verts and less hole counts. And you have to kind of find that balance, what looks good and how accurate it is, so it conforms to your object. So in this case, I would keep this and then I would save it. So this would be done. So for simple meshes, use simplified collisions. For everything else, use convex decomposition. And to go a step beyond that, for more specific collisions and more control over your collisions, you have to create them inside your 3D modeling application, inside Maya. So now we're going to cover how to create custom collisions using Maya. First, let's cover some basics. When you create custom collisions in Maya, these collisions are identified by UE5 importer based on their name. And it's a separate mesh, a separate object, that gets associated along with your mesh. So you'll be exporting your static mesh and a custom collision that's going to be overlapping that mesh. And there's a specific naming syntax that you need to use in order for UE5 importer to assign that collision. Now there are a few naming syntax you should be using, but we're only going to focus on one. But I'll go through them so you know that there's more, but you don't really need to use all of them. You just need to use one. So one is UBX underscore, name of your mesh, and then you can assign a number afterwards if there's more collisions associated with your mesh. And this is a box collision. So UBX underscore is a box collision. UCP underscore is a capsule collision. USP underscore is a sphere collision. And UCX underscore is a convex collision. And we're actually going to ignore the first 3 because we don't need to use them. We have that option by using simplified collision or auto convex collision. And we're only going to focus on using just one, which is UCX underscore for convex collision. This is the only one I've been using, and it's the only one you really need. Now, there are a few things you need to understand when you are using and creating convex collision UCX_ to create collisions in Maya. You must use convex shapes. They cannot be concave. And convex shape is a rounded outwards shape. It expands, while concave shape is rounded inward or caves in. So you have to use convex shapes, not concave. And here's the difference. On the left, this is a convex shape, which will work for your custom collision when creating them in Maya and when you import them into UE5. And your custom collisions cannot be concave. It cannot cave into itself. Your shapes cannot have any holes, and UCX_ must be an uppercase prefix. And the rest of the name must be your mesh's name. So you will have UCX_, name of the mesh, and if you have additional meshes, additional collisions, you can use numbers afterwards. So you would add _00, _01, so you can have more collisions along with your mesh. You would just have to assign a postfix of a number. So you would have UCX_ mesh of your name _00. And if you have additional ones, you would just assign _01, 02, and so on. Now let's cover these in actual practice. I'm going to use a cube first, but then we'll expand onto more complex objects. So this is a simple cube that's 100 centimeters in width, height, and depth. And this is going to be our object. First thing you need to do is make sure that you name your objects inside Maya. So let's go ahead and name this cube. Keep it simple. Now, if I want to have a custom collision generated in Maya, I would need to create another primitive, another similar shape that will work as the collision. So you have your object, and then you have additional primitive shape that is your collision. So in this case, I can either create a whole new cube, and that's what you would usually do, or you could just duplicate this cube and assign an appropriate syntax so UE5 understands that you have collisions with your object. But instead of duplicating it, let's go ahead and treat this as we would be creating our own collision. So you would usually create a cube, and then you would have to resize it. So since we are going to be using UCX_ syntax for convex collisions, you can resize this cube, this mesh, simply by scaling it in any direction that you want. You can even modify vertices. So if I go ahead and switch over to Vertex component mode, I could begin to create this collision and modify the verts like so. I can even extrude certain parts. You just have to make sure that they are not concave, that the shape is not concave. It has to be convex. Let's keep it simple and actually just work with the scale tool. So I'm gonna bring this up and I'm gonna make this shape slightly different so we can kind of see what the actual collision will be and there's no confusion of the auto-generated collision inside UE5. So I'm just going to create something like this so we can identify this shape much better. And we know that this is the collision that we exported. But of course, you would make it fit to the boundaries of your object. So I'm only going to have one collision for right now, and I need to name this collision. So our mesh name is cube. Our collision name needs to have uppercase UCX_, then name of the object. And then if we have more collisions, we would assign underscore and then a number. In this case, we don't have additional collisions. So let's go ahead and just keep it simple by naming it like we have UCX_, name of the mesh. That's it. And we'll get back to creating multiple collisions by assigning a postfix of numbers. So now to export your mesh and the collision associated with it, we need to select all of them together and then export the selection. So you would go to File, Export Selection. And let's go ahead and overwrite our existing cube. We already have it, so I'm just going to simply overwrite it and replace it. And let's select it, make sure the file name is cube, or you can name it anything you want. The name of the mesh inside Maya does not have to be the one you export, but to keep it simple and consistent, I'm going to give it the same name for the FBX file. And we're going to export it as FBX. And export selection, and yes, overwrite, replace. Now inside UE5, we already have this cube. I'm going to go ahead and delete it so we can import a brand new object and then deal with the re-import and any issues we may have. But let's start clean, fresh by deleting this existing cube so we don't have this mesh. So I'm going to simply select it and then or right click on it and you can choose delete or just hit delete on the selected object. And yes. And then I'm simply going to grab this folder, just take this cube and drop it to import it. So whenever you import a brand new object, you have all the same options. So let's go ahead and reset them. And whether you have generate missile collisions on or off does not matter because we have our own custom collision associated with the mesh. And UE5 will actually ignore this because we have our own collisions. Let's go ahead and keep it on just so we know that we do bring in our own custom collisions with the mesh because we're not missing any. Let's go ahead and import all. And let's go ahead and select our cube. I'm going to double click on it to open up Static Mesh Editor. Let's go to Show and Simple Collisions. And here's our custom simple collision that we exported. So that's the simple version of creating your own custom collisions and then importing them into UE5. Now let's go ahead and delete this and regenerate custom collisions inside UE5 because I want to show you the re-import process and what happens. So I'm going to simply choose box simplified collision. Let's go ahead and save it. And let's modify this cube to something else. Again, just make it larger so we know it stands out. And let's export again as if we were modifying the mesh, modifying the collision, and then re-exporting. I'm going to simply select both of them, export selection, override our existing cube. So our cube right now has collisions, and they have been generated inside UE5. So think of this as when you import a mesh and you don't have collisions and you generate missing collisions, and then you work on your own collisions and have to re-import the mesh and have brand new collisions associated with it from Maya. When you do this, you would simply take your mesh and then re-import by right-clicking on it inside the content browser and hit re-import. It re-imports the brand new mesh, the updated mesh we just had in Maya. But then when you take a look at the mesh, you can see that we have our brand new collision imported with the mesh, but also we have the old collision right here that was assigned by UE5. So when you re-import the mesh with custom collisions and your mesh already has some collisions on top of it, you need to delete and remove all collisions from it if you're going to be re-importing with brand new collisions. So you would go to collision, remove collisions, save it, and then re-import the mesh. And now we have our custom collisions and we don't have those auto-generated collisions also with the mesh. And now if you simply update, let's change our collision, let's re-export, and then re-import. Whenever you re-import and you had collisions already that were imported with the mesh, it gets updated automatically. So there's a small little caveat that if you have auto-generated in UE5, you need to remove it and then import your mesh with your own custom collisions. And every time you re-import after that, the collisions get updated. They don't get added on top, but they do get added on top if you had auto-generated collisions in UE5 first. So now you don't have to have cube-like collisions. It's easy to work with. They're simple. However, you can go ahead and modify. Let's make it slightly bigger like so. And I'm going to modify at a vert level and make this angled. So here's our new collision right here. Let's go ahead and export these again and see what happens. I'm going to override the cube and re-import. You can actually re-import by going to Asset, right from the static mesh editor, and choosing re-import name of the mesh. And here's our new collision. So you can see that we can angle and we can modify the default cube at a vertex level, and that collision will retain its shape. And we can also extrude faces. So let me undo this. Go back to our cube shape, and I can take the faces and I could extrude and then modify like so. So you can extrude additional faces and make your collision a little bit more complex and have more geometry to it, and it will retain its shape as long as it's convex. Let's go ahead and export this and then re-import. So you can see it updated and retained its shape. The problem is when you have it more of a concave shape. So the moment you begin to cave in inwards and create more of a concave shape like so, this right here is not going to work. It needs to be outwards. So let's go ahead and export this right here, and you're going to see what happens. We're not going to retain the shape. It's actually going to round everything out. And let me position my camera right here and re-import. So you can see we had that little concave section right here, and then actually rounded it out and introduced that geometry here on top. And you can kind of see it right here. This is where we had the geometry, but UE5 does not like collisions that are concave, and it rounded it out and created that collision at the top. So be careful, make sure your collision is convex, not concave. For more complex meshes, you have to use and create multiple collision holes. So let's focus on this doorway, and I'm going to show you how to create multiple collision holes. So for this, I would use a cube or multiple cubes as my collision. So let's go ahead and create a cube, and you just begin to resize it and scale it. You can also use vertex or edge or face component mode to modify the cube. So let me go ahead and just start reshaping this and making it bigger. Alright, so here's my first shape right here. And let me actually make it slightly bigger so it kind of overlaps the mesh more so you can see it better. But you basically align it to the boundaries of your object as much as you need and overlap your object. So first collision hole right here. Let's go ahead and rename it. So I'm going to grab the name of the mesh. And in this case, I have the name of the mesh, doorway underscore test. I'm going to make a copy of it because I want to make sure that it's exactly the same that I input into the collision. Select the collision, name it UCX underscore name of the mesh underscore, and let's name the first collision with a postfix of a number underscore 00. So that's the first one. Then I'm going to make a copy of it, Control D, and move it to the other side. And because I already renamed it, it names it as 01. If you need to name it manually, for the second name, for the second collision hole, give it underscore 01. Any additional ones, get 02, 03, and so on assigned to it. So I have 2. I'm going to make a copy of this. It already gives it a name as 02, so I don't need to rename it. And I would just simply position it right here and modify it. Let's go ahead and snap this. You can go in the front view, you can go side view. You don't have to be in the perspective viewport, of course. Now, when it comes to this, if I want a little bit more of an arch, then I would probably create a mesh, something like this, or a collision hole, something like this, where it kind of, it's a simple cube, and I would try to keep the collisions as simple as I could. So this would be my second one. Then I would make a copy of it, move it over. It is recommended to leave a very small gap between your collisions. So if I move this out of the way temporarily, you should have a very small gap between. Nothing's going to happen. You can overlap collisions and it will work, but Epic recommends that you leave a small gap between your collisions. Let me go ahead and position this right there. Now I can go ahead and modify the collision hole for this over here. Let's bring this up. And then I would need to create one more and bridge this gap. And in this case, I would have 5 collision holes. Let me make a copy of this. I would then take this piece right here, move it up, and align it. And then I would take this and make sure that these have a very small, tiny gap between all of them. And actually, let's go ahead and take this one and overlap it, just so you get to see that they will get exported. All right, so I have 5 collision hole meshes. Let me double check the names. Everything is correct. You can have missing numbers in the names. So let's say I have 03. Let's name this one 08. Just so you get to see that it doesn't matter. As long as you have a number at the end, you could have missing numbers in between that will still work. So I have 5 collision holes in the mesh. Let's select everything. Export selection. I'm going to name this doorway collision test and export as FBX with all the same options as before. And then let's take this mesh, drag it into the content browser, and import it with the default settings. Again, generate missing collisions doesn't matter because we don't have any missing collisions. And let's find that mesh. Let's open it up. Actually, let me search for it. Doorway collision test. Let's open that up. And you can see right here we have 5 collision holes. And let's take a look at them. Show simple collision. And you can see this one is overlapping. Again, not a big deal, but do leave that small gap. Everything is convex, so everything works. And the naming also imported, so missing collisions or missing numbers in between your collision holes does not make a difference as long as you have a number assigned at the end. So that is how you create multiple collision holes for more complex objects. Now there's one option in the static mesh editor. If you scroll down and find collision settings right here, collision complexity. And I see a lot of people changing this to use complex collision as simple. What that does, it takes your mesh, and instead of using simplified collisions, these collision holes that we create, and it uses the geometry, the triangles as collision. So it ignores all the collisions that we created, and it uses the object as the collision. And you do not want to do this because it's expensive. You shouldn't be using this for environment assets, for static meshes that make up your world. You want to use this collision that we created in this tutorial. And a lot of people just tend to switch it and make things more expensive, but you do not need to do this. You gotta use your simplified collision holes. So to show you what that would look like and what it actually does, I'm gonna use complex collision as simple. So now it will ignore the collision holes we created. And actually, let's go ahead and remove them. And you can take a look at complex collision, what that would look like by going to show and enabling complex collision. And we're already using it. Let me reset it really quick just so you get to see that wireframe. So it uses the geometry as collision now. And if I save this, actually let me reset it because right now it's not going to work. If I don't set this to use complex simple, we don't have any collisions. We're just showing it what that would look like, but we don't have it enabled. Let me go ahead and place it just so you get to see it. So right now I removed all the collision. Nothing works. A lot of people just go over here, instead of creating their own collisions, importing it, or just using what we covered, they go to collision complexity and they change it to use complex collision as simple. Now it uses per poly, per triangle collision of the mesh. Let's save it. And now I have collision and I can walk through it. And it's very accurate because it's exactly what you see. It's exactly what the mesh is, but it's expensive because now everything is calculated per polygon, per triangle. And even though this may not be a very complex mesh, it gets very expensive very quick because this mesh would be used everywhere. And the more complex the mesh gets, the more triangles you have and the more things that would have to get calculated per triangle, per poly. So don't use this. It's expensive unless you know what you're doing and you use it for some other purposes. But for environment design, for modular assets, for your main static meshes that make up the world, you do not want to change this to use complex collisions simply. You want to go back to default and create your own collisions, just like we did in this video. And now we don't have it, but we have a copy of it and we can go ahead and re-import it. And now we have our custom collisions. And one more, very last thing you have an option for is using block and volumes. So instead of using collisions, you can actually create a block and volume and use that as your collision. Now that's not done inside the static mesh editor, but it's created by using the place actor panel, going to volumes icon and either searching for block and volume or it's right here at the top. Just drag it. It gives you a box. And this is a block and volume now. It's invisible in game, so if I spawn, it's not going to be seen, but I cannot walk through it. It blocks me. So you would just simply use this block and volume and you can resize it by hitting Shift 7. Goes into the brush editing mode and then you can select vertices, you can select faces, and you can reshape this and change to kind of fit certain parts of the mesh if you need to use this as your collision or as your blocking of a certain area within the mesh or around the mesh. So this is an option for you to use. Of course, this is not something you'd want to do for your main meshes because you have collisions, but there are times maybe you need to block certain parts and you have block and volumes for that. And then once you are done resizing it, leave the brush editing mode, hit Shift 1 to go back. And let me actually position this right over the door just so you know this works. Play from here and it will stop the player from going through it. So this is how you create custom collisions in UE5 or in Maya and then import them into UE5. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial and I will see you in the next one.